Robert Margolacci of the MindShare Learning Report, and welcome to this special edition of MindShareTV Live InnovateHERs podcast series, episode number 4, featuring co-author Kathy Hurley with special guests Silver McDonald and Jane Kubasik. Thank you very much for joining us today. Kathy Hurley is in the house. Kathy is my former vice president at the Learning Company, Mr. Wonderful. And we're hosting this very wonderful series to really dig deeper and explore why purpose-driven women, entrepreneurial women, rise to the top. With that, Kathy Hurley, I'm going to pass the baton over to you to introduce our special guests who appear in the book, and perhaps you can share a little bit about the inspiration on the book first.
Yeah, well, thank you for talking about our tagline. It's called InnovateHERs, Why Purpose-Driven Entrepreneurial Women Rise to the Top. And I'll tell you a little bit about the book, but I have two very special women with me today who I think represent totally this book. And I'm anxious to have you hear from them, and I will introduce them and then have them talk a little bit about their background also. But I did want to mention my background is I retired after 50 years of being in the publishing industry. That says enough. And I'm doing some work with some nonprofit groups, and finished writing the book, which took a big chunk of 2 years to do. And I'm happy that it turned out the way it did, but happy that it's finished. I was so happy to have a co-author, Bobby Kirshan, who many of you may know because she's done a lot of research, written a lot of books, more of the scholarly kind of books, research books. So she really wanted to do something that was more in the consumer area. We talked about what was really needed. We both work with a lot of women's groups. We have a lot of female friends, and we do believe that women are really are the epitome of entrepreneurs. And Bobby had done some work at Penn State where she worked with the entrepreneurial mindset. So the book is based in research. What we did is we looked at all the skills and traits that people need to be entrepreneurs, and we interviewed 29 women from all over the world. We have young women, old women, we have ethnic women, we have a great variety from every continent. So it's been terrific having these people to come on to Robert's podcast. And I really want to thank Robert for doing this over a year's period of time. It's pretty exciting.
My pleasure. And we're amongst legends in the industry. So I'm really fascinated to learn more about the history and the inspiration.
Yeah. And, we didn't set out to have people who were in education. That was not what we wanted. But it seems that everybody has education in their background. It seems to be that's kind of drives the whole purpose. And when you hear these stories, you see how that really does resonate. I'm not going to go over each of the skills and traits, but I'm hoping the speakers will mention some of the traits or some of the skills that they have. And then for today's session, we're going to ask them some questions about what we call inhibitors, what kind of can stand in your way being an entrepreneur. So I want to introduce Jane Kubasik, who I had the pleasure of being on her board. And it was 114th partnership. They developed the Spark 101 STEM skills videos. And she can maybe tell you how you can see those videos, because they're really amazing videos. They take place in corporate America, where they show these are the jobs that kids are going to be doing. And this is why they really need to do their math programs, their science programs, so that they can handle these jobs. And they're just going to live forever, I'm sure. So Jane will talk a little bit about that. And then Silver McDonald, who's another person I've had the pleasure of working with through many companies. Now as a consultant. We were colleagues at Pearson. But she has had an incredible background, and she's now with a company called Hazel Health, Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing. Hope I have that right. I think you do.
Pretty close.
You're one of those people that you juggle everything. So I want to welcome both of you. So I'm going to get started. I'm not going to go in any particular order. We'll go back and forth. I think Robert has some questions too. He's going to ask you. And if at any time you want to jump in on the other person's conversation, if you've looked at some of these, we have done that a lot where someone will say, I have no confidence. And someone else will say, well, I'm very confident, and at the end, I may mention some of the things we found from the book that I think you would find to be interesting. And then we'll end it up. And that's enough of me talking. So I'm going to turn it over to Jane and say, Jane, what were some of the skills and traits maybe that you thought you had as becoming an entrepreneur? Maybe give a little bit about some of the stuff that you've done in the past.
Well, I think I'll just start with a context statement and kind of pull into the direct question. My father was born in rural Virginia, dropped out of high school, lied about his age to join the Air Force, and then my mother married her as a high school senior herself, and then they took off to all of his postings around the world, and they just moved constantly. Had 4 kids. We went from living in boarding houses to trailer parks to apartments, and then finally a home. So the journey to get somewhere kind of builds a certain level of perspective, point of view, skills in a little bit different ways, I think, in terms of like figuring out how is it persistence? When you talk about the skills that you've talked about and identified in the book, I went back and forth on which of the skills were most relevant to me, which was kind of an interesting dialogue. But ultimately, I got into this field by starting out as an accounting major in college. And so I was in college, went to the job board, saw that they were hiring accountants. I had a lot of student debt. I was getting more student debt by the day, and decided that accounting is for me because it pays the bills. There were some great things about accounting. And I really like the idea of changing teams, changing locations, learning about different business ideas. But it was kind of demanding. It's 100-hour weeks, made it difficult to raise a family, lots of complications in that. It wasn't particularly friendly to women at the time. When I was one of the first waves of hiring of women in the industry, but then moved over to staying at home with my family, volunteered at schools, and I got tapped to join the school strategic planning committee, and then realized that, wow, I actually know some things that could be helpful here. Ended up running a local nonprofit for a while. I met Kathy at that stage, and that was right when we were about to become a national nonprofit. And that, as she mentioned earlier, is the 114th partnership that worked on the collaboration opportunities between education and the employment community. So what did I miss in that?
No, I think you really hit it all. That's great. Silver, do you want to give a little bit about your background and kind of how you ended up here?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Robert, for having us. And reading Jane's story as well, there was a lot of commonality, a lot of movement and transition in early childhood, a lot of tenacity and persistence. And Jane and I were talking before the show started about, I also changed my college major in part to align to something that I thought would be more widely available in the mainstream. I grew up on Kauai, so in the Hawaiian Islands, and moved to the mainland when I was 16. After college, my whole track was pretty much with startups. So my first startup was a company that was called Alpha Online for just a couple of months. And then we were acquired by Razorfish, which is one of the early media companies taking organizations online. 60 Minutes did an episode on us called the .com Kids. That's how early on it was. And so really jumped into a really dynamic, amazing early career that we grew to be over 2,000 in a couple of years, a big global IPO, a lot of great collaboration, a lot of autonomy, just given first roles out of college, and a lot of pride in what we were doing. And so that was super immersive and fun and really fulfilling for a long time. And then I realized I was getting a little bit burnt out, and my whole family has been in education my entire life. My grandmother was a teacher in San Diego for 30 years. My mom was a special ed teacher. And so wanted to marry the two. And that's how I started on the career track with ed tech specifically.
Well, and you've had a quite varied career with some of the companies you've worked with, and you've had some pretty exciting jobs. So
it's been a lot of fun.
What are the skills or traits would you pick out that really jumped out at you?
I think fostering relationships and collaboration, being able to build teams and build consensus, but also really push for the North Star of where we need to go as an organization. And I do think bringing a lot of tenacity to the table and just rolling up my sleeves. I'm one who's with your team when you're getting things done, whether it's getting an RFP out, after hours or something that's more glamorous, but really making sure that you're in there with your team, shepherding them along and getting everyone to the end goal.
Interesting. Jane, what traits and skills do you think that really helped you?
I would say I would struggle a lot with deciding between the ideation, coming up with ideas when you're stuck, versus persistence. I think those skills are really important. I think I landed on ideation as more important than persistence, because persistence for me meant that you might not give up the fight for something and realizing that you needed to change a little bit, especially when you're working in the collaborative space. We weren't the experts. We were merely the facilitators. So we had to respect that we had, business people that had certain points of view, perspectives about how they thought they should be involved in education. And there were educators who certainly had their own point of view about where they thought business could be helpful in the world of education. And those two groups were, quite significantly opposed. I think it's something like 95% of educators thought businesses should focus on donating money and giving them equipment, and 85% of the business people felt that they should be donating pro bono services and volunteering in classrooms. So it's very different. So I think a lot of the skills had to be of like listening, really understanding the context in which these two organizations or entities were coming from, and then kind of find this common ground for them. And I think one of the breakthroughs we had in that was dealing with the teachers unions in Montgomery County Public Schools. They were always not necessarily open to the idea of working with the business community, but we realized that by pointing out that they hire graduates as well. They want to have people that arrive as teachers in the school or as working in the facilities, people that are competent, people that have the ability to continue learning, people that are enthusiastic about their jobs. And we kind of struck a chord there, and as long as we stayed in our lane, we actually had a pretty good run.
Kathy, perhaps I'll jump in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kathy.
I was going to say both of these people would be very good keynote speakers for your meeting.
I think so.
They're very, very, very interesting people.
Fascinating. And we're thinking of going back to Montreal, Kathy, because they treated us so well at McGill, and everyone loves Montreal. But one of the themes that emerged at our summit was the notion of the growth mindset. And one of the professors talked about the growth mindset as a skill. Silver, I'll direct this question to you for starters. Talk to me about, your career trajectory clearly demonstrates a growth mindset. Is that nurtured or nature or nurture? Can you hone that as a skill? Talk to me about that.
I think there's definitely a nature piece to it. And I think it's the people you surround yourself with later on. Kathy Hurley specifically has absolutely been a mentor and helped me to make some bigger leaps than I planned to at times. And so I started off with SchoolNet, we were a small startup out of New York, which primarily worked with large urbans. We grew on to it was kind of the first LMS in a way, and then it grew to be quite a bit more over time. And we had a really strong trajectory. And I started off leading client services, and then they asked me to run sales. And I was like, who would ever want to run sales in ed tech? You must be crazy. So I remember getting a call. It was like classic Kellogg. But I did take it on, and I totally changed our sales team, and I changed our approach. And we were extremely successful and acquired by Pearson shortly after. And when I got to Pearson, every single person I met said, you have to meet Kathy Hurley. And it turned out that I was taken on a course, and we became instant friends. They actually asked me to take on a team that she had been leading previously. So all the stuff I was working on, she gave me a bunch of resources. And from Pearson, there was another engagement. And then I was approached about to be the head of the US for Lego education. And Kathy was one of the first people I called to have that conversation as well. And she's like, of course you're going to do it and you'll figure it out. And so, Lego Education was a really different company when I got there. It was classroom to classroom engagement. And we really wanted to grow bigger and faster and become much more of a true education company. So we started to engage with our districts grade level wide and cross grade level wide to have the scaffolding curriculum, and really built out the content side of what we were doing as well. So it's heavily education informed, and the types of growth that we had are completely different from when I had originally started with the company. District saw us as a really great aligned partner. And we did a lot of internal work of eliminating roles that had previously existed and adding new roles that aligned to where we were headed in the future. And the most currently I'm with Hazel Health, which I absolutely love, and Kathy's one of our partners. And it is completely dismantling any barriers to access to care for children across physical and mental health through telehealth. And amazing. So it's amazing. And so all these amazing districts are coming on, including my home state of Hawaii. And the stories are absolutely incredible. And it's so needed in meeting this incredible mental health crisis. But for a lot of our families, they don't even have support on the physical health side. And we work with school districts all across the country, and it's incredibly rewarding. And I think we were 30 people when I started about 2 years ago, and now we're over 300 and growing like crazy.
Well, well-being is at a crisis level right now in education, and so kudos to you for the impact that you're making. Jane, talk to me about the growth mindset and how that skill, if you will, helped you in your journey to where you are today.
Yeah, I think that and
mentorship as well. I guess you could add that to the equation. Yeah.
Well, I think it's challenging. Anytime you're starting something new, all of us started. The entrepreneurship theme of the book is that whether it was within an organization or starting a new organization, we all had to start somewhere. And typically when you're starting something, you make a lot of mistakes along the way. So when I think about the growth mindset, it's thinking that we weren't wrong. We just needed to keep learning. And so if that's something we were wrong, we would stop and say, okay, well, what did we learn from that? And even when things went right. So whenever we debriefed after something, we would stop and say, okay, so what did we commit? Where did we fall short? Where did we succeed? What are we learning? And what are we going to do next? And it created this culture where it was fine to talk about what didn't go well, because it's just meant as long as we were learning from it, it was fine. And Kathy was always really helpful with that because she asked really good questions. And she was never judgmental in terms of, you could have a bad day, you could have a bad month, you could have a bad year here and there along the way, but she was always positive that we would figure it out. And I think that confidence that people like Kathy give you and mentors kind of that get you back in the ring, and your team needs you to be confident, your team needs you to find a solution, was really important. So I think all of those things factor into that. I think also that something like wisdom comes from making a lot of mistakes and figuring it out. I think if everything goes really well for you, you probably aren't a very wise person. So when I give advice, it's like, well, because I did these 18 things wrong, let me give you this piece of advice about how you could get faster from point A to point B than I did.
That's right. Well, you did. I mean, you went from really being in the for-profit world to the nonprofit world, and then starting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about starting the small, really nonprofit in Montgomery County to making it an national program. How do you feel? Because you kind of, you always say that you're someone that you think you're risk adverse. So how did you get the skills to really do that, to achieve purpose-driven goals?
Well, I think the big idea was that we found something that worked in this small nonprofit. We found that if business focused on these two areas where schools were really, open to receiving, working in partnership and building trust with each other, then we had an opportunity to build something. And the first one of those was this kind of management consultancy. We worked with Harvard Business School, and they would provide us with different case studies. There was also the Harvard Education Project. I'm not quite sure if that's still around or not, but the school district we were working with at the time was involved in that. So they were used to the case study concept, but I thought it was a miss that they had isolated the educators into their own program. They weren't part of the broader Harvard Business Education program, but we would take those same cases, and sometimes different ones, and put them in a room with people from, Marriott and Lockheed Martin and United Healthcare, and let's see who else might have been in that group, Clark Construction, I could go on, Deloitte, Booz Allen Hamilton, some really very strong, national and international brands of people who, when you start putting out these challenges and having this case study format, all of a sudden people realized that they were kind of all equal as managers and leaders in their organizations. And they faced a lot of the same challenges. If you weren't the frontline employee, you were really someone who was trying to help the frontline employee do their job better. And so that really kind of broke the ice and started to build some trust because people became vulnerable in these sessions. And then that led the way to doing some of these broader projects. So we could actually scope out a project on onboarding for HR, or look at goal setting around college and career readiness, or look at ideas around reverse engineering of college readiness into the earlier grades. And the flip side of that, the second area where educators felt business could be helpful was in this concept of connecting what students were learning in their academic courses to careers. This idea of increasing student motivation to engage in the coursework and to consider more advanced coursework in a topic was an area that we played with. Our primary product in that area was something called the Young Professionals Conference. And so we brought a couple hundred students to our college campus, and businesses showed up with a real problem. So a foundation showed up with a grant, and the kids had to evaluate the different proposals and determine which organization was receiving the grant. One of the banks, it was M&T Bank at the time, showed up with an application for a loan, and the students had to make a determination as to whether that loan was viable. And the employer would then kind of tell what happened after with that particular problem. But the idea was they were taking on a problem just like they would in the workplace, and everybody was super engaged. The employers were engaged, the teachers were enthusiastic because the kids loved it. They started to see where they could go with the skills they were acquiring. And then Harvard wrote a case study about our organization in 2009, and they also published a book called Leading for Equity. It was primarily about Montgomery County Public Schools and the superintendent at the time, Dr. Jerry Wiest. And the book was really about the efforts of the entire school system, of which we were just one of many partners in that effort. But then people started reaching out and saying, well, can you help us? How do you do it? How do you get them to the table? How do you guys listen to each other? How do you get these projects? Or how do you get employers, engaging in this type of way? And so that was when we had to step back, and we couldn't be the really longly titled Montgomery County Business Roundtable for Education when there are actually several Montgomery counties even in the US. So we switched to this concept of the 1/14th partnership, because the 1/14th meridian is the beginning of the Great Continental Divide. And we decided we would be the place where we could bridge the divide between these two sectors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did think of you yesterday. I was at a meeting, and they had somebody who was probably the best known person in automotronics, is it? And they were showing how schools are picking that up and taking it in, and kids are making these just unbelievable devices and learning about math and science. And I'm like, oh, Jane was doing that many years ago.
Exactly. Well, we couldn't really take a conference didn't scale, right? And you're talking about providing access. We really kept coming back to this idea of equity. We were living in the DC area. We had access to all these great employers. We had access to a college campus. And is it really fair if you're living in a rural area, but you might be inspired by something, that is a job that's not necessarily in your area? So we decided to go virtual. And so we did a bunch of research on looking at what motivates a young person, an adolescent in particular, to engage in difficult coursework. And a lot of it came down to this concept of building a certain identity around being successful in this career. So it started with motivation. You had to relate it to something of interest to the young person. So you had to have a purpose up front. Then you had to give them a real problem to solve, and you needed to be specific about how you would gain entry into that career. And we turned those into these 10-minute interactive videos that were free, broadly available, and they covered a wide range of careers. And so the teacher could use them to create a lesson plan. Of course, we had some samples. It was all built with teachers. Teachers were in the room as the content was designed. Teachers created the materials. Former teachers were working on the production team. I mean, it just made it all work because it was designed for them. And that's the product today.
As I'm thinking about also Silver, it's gone from working from a very well-known ed tech company, really a tech company, to Pearson, who was really more of a publishing company and an ed tech company, to Bright Bites, which was doing a whole lot of things on data, and then to Lego, which was math and science, and then to go to health. So, I mean, you really made a lot of those changes yourself. So what do you think has kind of driven you to be successful in all those different careers?
One, I'm a really curious person. I just like to learn new things. And then two, I think I moved towards each one really purposely. And many of them were introduced through previous coworkers. So Lego Education came through one of our coworkers from Pearson out of London as an example. But I really like what each one stood for. So with Lego, I was actually really drawn to the fact that they're one of the #1 sustainability companies in the world. And I have gone through sustainability certification and whatnot, and really liked the aspiration of the brand, but also really liked the fact that we could actually bring it to all children through the school system, because many children will never have the opportunity to engage with Lego, even though many children want to, because it's such a great brand. And I like that it could bring out this like inner, engineer or scientist who may never have known that was in their skill set. And then with Hazel Health, I love the fact that it was dismantling. You have to be present in body and mind in order to learn, in order to thrive, in order to learn what your other skills are and what you want to go into career-wise or vocation-wise. And so I really love the fact that when I'm in my all-hands meeting, we have doctors, we have nurses, we have therapists, we have teachers, we have engineers, and it's such an interesting mash of people and profiles that are all there for really strong reasons. And we really emphasize diversity. So our therapists, for example, are over 60% people of color, and we really mirror our student populations. So we have a high connectivity on the connection and completion rate around our mental health and physical health services. And similar to Jane's work in a way, many of our children have never seen a therapist who looks like them, let's say from an ethnicity perspective. And so it can also be aspirational for them to see somebody in those roles supporting them and helping to resolve something that's core for them or for their family.
Robert, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. After participating in this book project, what did you learn about yourself as you began to share your story? Did you discover something new about yourself after taking the EMP profile? I'll start with you, Jane.
I think it reminded me, I stepped out of it, or the nonprofit I was working with merged with another nonprofit. The assets were acquired by Learning Undefeated. So I've been kind of figuring out what I want to do next, mainly, doing some one-off mentoring of young people. But I realized that I hadn't really codified what I'd learned. He talked about this growth mindset, about learning from mistakes and also learning from successes. And so when Kathy reached out and asked if I participate, I thought that was actually, it's going to force me to reflect about, how I got to where I am. And then, somebody else who's starting nonprofits. I coach a lot of people who are starting nonprofits. But it still reminds me to go back to like that passion element, and I'm using some of the language with them around helping them identify, do they have the passion to work through the problems in this? Otherwise, it's a pretty tough haul because the whole curve is slow.
Silver, over to you. How did this book project impact your self-discovery?
Absolutely. Well, Bobby and Kathy were so fun and engaging in the interview process that I shared a lot more of my personal story than I ever had before. And so that I think Jane had the same experience. And so that alone was eye-opening to me, because so many people have reached out about that part of it. And then I also feel like, similar to what Jane said, when you're passionate about something, it becomes a refueling mechanism if you can incorporate it into your work or into your side projects or whatever it is. And so when you're doing something that you're really passionate about, it doesn't feel like work, and it's actually like refueling and energizing, which helps you in both your personal and professional life. But I think the interview process for the book was right before COVID too. And I resigned from Lego shortly after, partly just because of the travel schedule. And it was the first time there was a couple of years of like stillness to some extent. And just really emphasized the importance of balance and incorporating both the passion and the kind of steady states into all facets of your life, and not getting so much of my reward from the pure work side, which has definitely been my primary source of like motivation for a long time. So it was a really good reflection point for me overall.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. Over to you, Kathy.
I think both of you have a really good work-life balance, and that you're both pretty intense workers and really committed to your careers, but you do, find family time, and you also travel, and, you keep yourself very interesting, which I do, like about both of you. I'm gonna just mention a couple things that we learned, and I'd love for you to comment on, how you relate to this. because these are kind of some of the findings we got. The first one, and actually Jane referred to it, is that women are risk takers, but they're calculated risk takers. And I think you mentioned that when you had your family, you had to think about, women have other things they have to think about before they take a risk. And I think that came out. Any comments about that?
Yes, I think, you have to figure out, you have to decide where are you going to put your time and effort, what else you're responsible for. So it's a portfolio of risk, I like to think of it as, right? So you've got some things that are high risk, high reward, some things that are low risk, high reward, some things that are low risk but unfortunately low reward. So you do have to kind of think through what's going to happen. And I think, I came up with some ways, even in my professional side of helping people manage risk, like being able to name it, coming up with how likely it is to occur, thinking about how do you mitigate risk and making it part of a conversation, and made it less scary. We weren't internalizing it. And I think the staff people and our board members always liked the idea that we weren't afraid to talk about where we could fail.
Interesting. When you've gone from one coast to the other kind of overnight with jobs, you had to put a lot of thought into that, I'm sure. So what would you say?
I think my first thought when you were talking is I think I've run towards risk probably more than I potentially should, like big risk, big reward, and also things where I got a lot of enjoyment out of it because of the travel component or something else. I didn't have the challenge of deciding between that and, a family life at home. I've really pursued mostly the career side of it to the detriment of the personal side at times. And so now I feel like it's the first time I'm taking the time to step back and rebuild more of like the home and the foundation and that side of my life, to be honest.
Interesting. So this is always an interesting one. And I know, Robert, we've heard some things about that, but it's women have a high self-confidence, but many of them said they had imposter syndrome. Sometimes. Have you ever had imposter syndrome? I mean, it's not everybody, but that has come up.
Definitely.
Me too.
Well, I think
you all seem so confident.
Well, part of it is that, sometimes you can feel successful in a nonprofit setting, and then you would bump into this business person who kind of was dismissive over working in either the education sector or the nonprofit sector. It doesn't count, quote, the same way, which kind of like hits a little bit of an edge sometimes. But it's also a lot harder to be successful in some of these places. So I would remind myself, if any of these people that were transplanted into these environments were probably not successful. Lots of stories about former generals trying to run school systems, right? It just doesn't really work that way. It's really much more so. We were saying earlier, I mean, so much in the nonprofit world and in the education world for many years, that was where most of the collaboration had to take place. By nature, you didn't have positional power. You were trying to influence in different ways. And now I think a lot of those collaboration skills have migrated over into the business sector. I think companies are much more collaborative now in terms of coming up with, product, services, ideas. They realize you don't have positional power doesn't get you very far. It gets you fast, but it doesn't get you far.
Mm-hmm. Any comments on that?
I've absolutely had imposter syndrome without a doubt at many phases. It's also nice to look back even 5 or 10 years and just know how much you can say things with a firsthand knowledge now based upon the challenges that we have all managed ourselves or our teams or our organizations through. But Lego Education was one where I literally talked to Kathy multiple times during that interview process. And she was like, of course you're going to say yes. She's like, men always say they can do it and they're not any more qualified than you are. You're going to do it. And I did. It ended up being like one of, a fantastic part of my career. So I think women, I have to assume men struggle with imposter syndrome too, but I think women are more open about it.
Yeah. You have a question, Robert?
Final thoughts to share with any aspiring young women entrepreneurs like my daughter. She's in the cybersecurity space right now, just starting her career. That might serve them well. It's not a direct path. We all clearly demonstrate that. Mm-hmm. And any advice, any nuggets of advice for the young people in their 20s and how they might pursue and optimize their entrepreneurial career path.
One thing I would really recommend, and I spoke at Philadelphia Public Schools, it was a couple of years ago, but managing your network purposely. So making sure you are a great, peer and collaborator, and stay in touch with people, stay in touch with the people that you want to be mentors to you, stay in touch with people who may be further behind than you in the career path, but that you can be a mentor or connector. Like, I love connecting people across industries and roles, and I'm a good matchmaker too. I think it's all related, but really managing your network in a purposeful and thoughtful way, it grows and amplifies over time. And the types of connections and opportunities that I've been introduced to or been able to help other people really can be completely transformative for the trajectory of a career or an individual life. So I think that's something that deserves careful thought.
Well said, Silver. Jane.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think, we kind of coined these 3 M's. There's mastery over whatever content, that there's motivation, which is, kind of why you want to do something. But this concept of mobility, like how you actually get access to a field, how you know if you're doing well, how do you change fields, how do you understand the culture of the work environment? They all come from your network. And I don't think there's enough attention paid to that in terms of helping somebody, how they define themselves, how they present, how they identify who good network connections are. There's a difference between somebody somebody who's your mentor, somebody who's your coach, somebody who's your sponsor, but really taking advantage of people you're introduced to stay in touch with them and to give back as well. What you learn along the way, it really does build a lot of long-lasting, trusting relationships. That's why all of us will pick up the phone when Kathy calls.
Absolutely.
Well said.
Mentoring came out really high, people, and of course, I'm the oldest of the group. So I had a tendency to have, I think, a lot of men mentors because there were not a lot of women. But I have to say, having a woman at Pearson who was a real mentor for me was really an incredible opportunity. I remember when I asked her to write the foreword in the other book that I did, someone said, "How did you get Margie Spardino to write the foreword?" I said, "I asked her." People are afraid to do that kind of thing. But so how do you feel about mentoring? And mentoring, paying it forward. And I think you both touched on that you were doing a lot of that, paying it forward. Silver, you want to go first?
Yeah, it's something that I try to be really purposeful on, and I really, really enjoy. And so whether it's formal or informal mentoring, it's something that I try to incorporate across the board. And I'm also really grateful for the people who have been mentors for me. And I've also had good male mentors too. So I feel like I've been really lucky in that space, and I'm definitely intentional about it.
Jane?
Yes, and I kind of crossing since I'm out of the professional roles right now, I'm really more kind of people reach out, or I'm reaching out and catching up with people, and we find an opportunity to give, as Silver was saying there's the informal moment to share a nugget of wisdom, reference my earlier definition of wisdom. But then as well, there are a lot of young people that I'm finding that from all economic walks that really are lost. They don't like their job. They don't know what they want to do. And there's really such a disconnect in this area between helping a young person identify and name what motivates them, where they go, what to get the right credentials, and then how do they navigate, through these fields. And just one-on-one, doing that one-on-one instead of at scale, I'm actually finding quite rewarding right now.
That's great. Well, just 2 other things I'll make it quick, Robert, is that we found out. One was women score high on interpersonal sensitivity, empathy, which wouldn't surprise you, which leads to better retention of teams, but they also can fire people better, which we thought that was interesting because they're more sensitive to just saying, we're reorganizing, your job is gone, to saying, I'll help you find something else. This just wasn't a good fit, so that was kind of interesting. And the other thing we found out that mothers, where fathers were more in there with leadership, that mothers, they always said, kind of taught them how to be entrepreneurs because mothers could juggle so much. And they watched them do the PTA, the church, the family, the wife, the whole thing and so that was kind of an interesting thing. So we did, and I just want to put a plug in for the resources we show in the newsletter that we get, that every month we list the podcasts that we've done, and we list new books that are out. And we have stories. If you know anybody that you think represents a really good woman entrepreneur, tell the story. We'll put it in, and we've been so happy to have people like you to be supporting this. And the book's doing really well.
Great.
Here, I have a copy. And can I say something, Kathy? Men have a lot to learn from reading this book. There are some great golden nuggets.
Well, you're like one of our biggest fans. This is great, Robert. You're a good man. I knew that when you worked for me.
The growth mindset is something I embraced in this case, especially. And you've all been an inspiration today, and to many people that you've mentored over time. Each of you exhibit that growth mindset and entrepreneurial spirit. So thank you for joining us today, Jane Silver, and Kathy is my co-host today.
And this is great. Thank you for having us. And I look forward to keeping in touch with all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That concludes this special edition of the MindShareTV Live InnovateHERs podcast series, episode number 4. Be sure to check out InnovateHERs.org to learn more, and MindShareLearning.com to get your latest issue of our report. And then, till next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and keep the learning curve steep.